All right. Welcome to podcast 8 of the Performance Show. We've got Australian tennis player Addison joining us. So Aaron is an Australian tennis player making his way on the ATP Tour. He's reached a high ranking of 990 and a doubles ranking of 829, primarily playing on the Futures circuit and some challenges, and has just reached a high ranking of 41 in Australia. So that's a phenomenal effort. Aaron, thanks for joining us.
Lloyd, thanks for having me, mate.
Absolutely. So before the coronavirus hit back in February of early this year, what was the year looking like for you?
So I had a pretty big year lined up. Obviously, as a lot of players did. I was looking at about a fairly long swing through Europe that was basically planned for, I would have said, maybe 3 or 4 weeks after we found out we were going into lockdown. So, look, unfortunately, that doesn't pan out the way I wanted to. And it's always tough. You've just gone through, I sort of went through a 5 or 6 month sort of pre-season because I had to cut my year short at the end of last year. So to go through all that and then basically end up in another pre-season straight away was pretty tough.
Yep.
But, that's just the way it is this year. So.
Yeah, and for those out there, those who don't play tennis, who aren't familiar with the system, how would you define the Futures system? How would you define that?
Look, it's essentially for the really uneducated, it's the third tier of professional tennis. So behind the ATP Tour and the ATP Challenger Tour. And so, there's basically events all over the world. There's multiple events every week. So you can choose where to go, where to play. But obviously prize money is a lot less. Facilities tend to not be as good. In some cases, facilities are downright terrible. But look, it's one of those things you've kind of got to get through that level in order to progress to the next level. So,
yeah. And prize money wise, you said it was low. How much prize money on average would you get for actually winning a Futures tournament?
So winning a 15K future, I think it's somewhere around the $2,000 mark. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly. I haven't won one. But somewhere around there. And then 25K future, maybe a little bit more, maybe 3.5. But again, that's, obviously we're talking winning the tournament is getting you that. And that's what, maybe 5% of what losing first round at a Grand Slam is. So
Right.
There's just a lot of disparity with what that level earns, I guess.
Yeah. And you've traveled to Europe, you've gone to Asia. These things, trips cost a lot of money, and you've earned around 28,000 in your career, which is, still an incredible achievement. But no one really knows the expenses that go into that. So could you describe briefly what are some of the main expenses? How much would you pay per year in a season?
Look, for me, obviously, I'm not spending as much as a lot of people would because me, along with a lot of the other guys I travel with, we like living on what would best be described as a shoestring budget. So I would say on an average year, I'd spend probably around the 20 to 30 grand mark. But as you said, career prize money, 28,000, maybe that sounds okay. But when you spread that over 5 years, it's only 5 or 6K a year. We're fortunate in Australia. We do have a good money tournament system. So if I make maybe that again from money tournaments, and then, part-time coaching, when you're back in Australia as well, sort of ends up paying the bills, but obviously it makes it tough because you got to do a few different things in order to make that money.
Do you have any, maybe except for your parents and family, do you have any financial support systems like sponsors, those sort of things?
Not financially. I'm lucky to work with a couple of good teams. I work with 10X Pro. They do my rackets and stuff. So they're a great pro stock frame based company in Sydney. And then just this year, I've jumped on board with Misa, which is a new clothing brand that's just come out. So luckily, I've got those sort of equipment issues, I guess, taken care of, which is great. That takes, I mean, just on racket costs alone, you're looking at probably at least $1,000 a year if you're buying your own stuff. But yeah, financially, yeah, it's all independent. So
Yeah. Yeah. So being ranked, I mean, you're at the lower end. What's the next step for you to get into the next top 500, for example, and playing players like Mark Polman's, Omar Jasika, that level of play? What's that next step for you?
Well, I mean, funny you mentioned Omar. I actually played him last week at the UTR event. Good to see him back out on court, by the way.
Absolutely.
But look, it's not so much a tennis level thing once you're around the 1,000 to 500 mark. It's more, maybe it's time and place in terms of getting a good draw one week. Maybe it's mental approach a little bit more than actual ball striking ability. For me, everyone from, you could probably even bring it up to 300-400. Everyone from sort of that ranking to maybe 1,000 to 1,200 can strike the ball pretty well. That's not really an issue. It's putting everything else together. The physical, the mental, getting your off court conditioning in, all that sort of thing. So probably best described as the 1%ers.
Yeah. And who's the best player that you've played against in your career?
I was lucky enough to play Nick Kyrgios back in, that's a long time ago now. That was in 18 under nationals. And obviously he's gone a long way since then. But yeah, look, I play Premier League with Alex Bolt, which is great being around him and being able to be courtside while he's playing at that sort of stuff. And we're lucky enough, we've also got Blake Mott, who's also very highly ranked, and we've got Peter Luchak in that team as well, who's a former Davis Cup player. So surrounding yourself with those sort of guys is so key to learning what it takes to be at a higher level and play at a higher level.
Yeah, for sure. And you've been to Europe and Asia a couple of times now. How many times, or how long would each tournament block go for, and how many times a year would you plan to go?
I made a pretty big mistake one of my first years on tour where I went for too long. And I think that's probably, if it was something that I could say to younger Aaron or any younger player wanting to start getting onto the Futures Tour, it's, what you just said, time your blocks really well. Don't think you can go to Europe and play a 16-week schedule without breaks, without doing some training weeks over there. It just won't happen. So I played, a 13-week schedule where I played 13 tournaments. And obviously that was not good scheduling. Since then, I've probably learned that the best method for me is to have about 4 to 6 weeks on, and then somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks off, and then 4 to 6 weeks on again.
So when you're off, when you're off, do you come back to Melbourne?
Ideally, yeah. Ideally, I'd be back in Melbourne. Obviously, that's a lot easier if I've played a 4 to 6 week swing in Asia, because you're a lot closer to home. You get a cheap flight, particularly obviously when you come from somewhere like Thailand or whatnot. You can jump on a cheap flight home and come back and do your training block. I've got my coach here, Steve Savino. So obviously we'll put in a lot of time together in those training blocks. And then, but it does become harder if you're in, let's say, the States or you're in Europe, because your travel costs to come home are a lot more. So it would become much more key to have some form of base in Europe, which is then why a lot of the guys will play European club tennis and things like that as well.
When you travel, does Steve come along with you, or does he stay back in Melbourne?
No, he's back in Melbourne. Obviously, ideally, it'd be great if I could get him along. But it comes back to that financial input, I guess. If I had the money for it, it'd be great. Yeah, sure. I would be all over it. Steve would be there every week. And again, that's probably one of the 1%ers that we mentioned before, is having a coach with you on tour can be a major factor in maybe his gives you a calming look on court and you win the next 3 points instead of blowing up and snapping a racket, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's an emotional roller coaster, I would say.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess you're your own coach when you travel on your own, right?
Yeah, basically. We're also obviously particularly the Aussie guys I feel on tour, we're all quite close. So if I'm traveling with any of the other Aussie guys, we try to do a little bit of our own. We'll always try and watch each other and that sort of thing. Yeah. Particularly if you're away for a longer stint of tournaments, and you're away from family for a long time. You're away from your coach for a long time. So being around people who you're happy to say, right, can you come out and feed me a basket of balls this afternoon? That's a big thing. You can't just choose to travel with anyone. Right.
Yeah, you've got to have close connections when you almost want a home away from home. So if you get that supportive environment around you, you're probably going to do a lot better.
Yeah, exactly right.
When you made the quarters of, if I'm pronouncing it right, Heracloin in Greece of 2019 last year.
Yeah.
Was that during a shorter tournament block for you?
So that was that week was my second week of a 6-week trip.
Okay. So pretty fresh off the bat.
Yeah, fairly fresh off the bat, but also because I'd already been in Heraclion for a week before that, and lost first round the week before. So I'd had a week and a half, 2 weeks in the conditions, which can be a major factor. Luckily, with futures level tournaments, a lot of the time you'll have 2 or 3 tournaments back to back at the same venue, which helps you out if you need that extra time to get used to conditions. But yeah, that quarterfinal, obviously, that's, making quarterfinals, making semifinals, making deep runs is what you're aiming to do. So if you can, get, as you said, pretty quick off the bat, second week of a trip, get a big result, that's always really good for the confidence as well. If you ever end up in a situation where you lose a few weeks in a row, particularly at the start of the trip, it's very, very easy to sort of spiral down the rabbit hole and then lose 5, 6, 7 straight. And suddenly your trip's over before you've even really gotten anywhere. It affects you a lot because every single loss, the expectation that you put on yourself becomes higher to succeed. And I think it can be a major reason why people quit from my level, quit from futures level, even though they might actually have the talent and the ability to go on and succeed at a pretty high level. If you find yourself stuck at this level, it can be very tough. Yeah, it's probably the biggest hurdle, the futures circuit, because you've got the lowest points, you've got the lowest prize money, but then you've got to win the most amount of matches. I mean, I know a couple of years ago, I think they've taken away the qualifying. It's just main draw, right? So back a couple of years ago, if you were in the US, you'd have to win 4 qualifying matches and then a main draw match just to get 1 or 3 ATP points, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, it is. And look, so they did make qualifying smaller. I think qualifying's back on at about a 32 draw at futures level now. It's a lot smaller at challenges. They basically don't have qualifying at challenges anymore. But yeah, look, and that especially in those big tournaments in the US where they would play a massive qualifying draw, a 128 qualifying draw, to then get into main. So let's say first round main, you play someone who maybe it's actually 50-50 on paper with, but it's their first match and it's your 5th already for the week. Like, how hard's that physically to be playing that many more matches and then succeeding? Yeah. Which is, I guess, why in some respects, you want to shorten your time at a futures level as much as you can, particularly if you can manage to do it while you're, I guess, younger, as particularly late teens, early 20s. If you can sort of leapfrog into that maybe top 300 bracket so that you're already at challenges, can really avoid you being stagnant at a futures level.
Yeah, and you said the dropout rate is so high at futures level, and you've just got to find that edge to. And once you find that edge, you can just really steamroll. Look at players like Chris O'Connell. I mean, he came out of nowhere. Great success story. What do you have to implement in your game to sort of reach the main draw of challenges and be competitive in those events?
Again, same sort of those 1%ers. It is putting together wins for your confidence. It's finding a way to win tough matches. It's being physically 1% better. Mentally, maybe not as hard on yourself in certain situations. But also a little bit of, in some respects, you have to, for want of a better term, spend money to make money. Yep. You've got to be willing to invest in yourself, whether that's finding that extra $150 a week to get out on court with a private coach once or twice. Maybe it's, instead of sleeping at a dodgy Airbnb one week, you stay at the official hotel and back yourself to do well because you're surrounding yourself with a better situation. Yeah. Things like that. And that's, it's something that, obviously, I mean, you already mentioned Chris, start of last year, I played him at a futures event in Mornington, and lost 7-6, 6-3. And 8 months later, he's essentially about to crack the top 100 by the end of last year. So the gap is so small. And I think that's the thing maybe a lot of people miss, is that, that jump is not as big as maybe it seems, but in some ways it is, because there's a lot of things that go into making that jump. I
mean, 7-6, 6-3, I mean, that's a few points here and there in the breaker. And then maybe a break of serve in the second set. And
that's maybe holding on to a couple of service points when you're up in a tie break too. But.
Right. What do you feel that Tennis Australia or other organisations around the world like USTA, LTA can do to support players who are at your ranking category?
Look, the biggest thing for me that I've always felt, and don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly privy to the inner workings of Tennis Australia or any of those big organisations, but I've always felt that maybe the way that they spend their funding could be better shared by multiple athletes. That's always been my outlook. Is it better to give, let's say, $100,000 to one player, or is it better to give $10,000 to 10 players? Yeah. Essentially, that would take the pressure off of more players and give more players an opportunity potentially to progress. Maybe even it's a little bit like you're not giving that money essentially with strings attached. You're not saying, right, we're going to give you this if you work with a Tennis Australia coach. Because at the end of the day, Tennis Australia looks good, or any of those big organisations look good if any Australian player succeeds. So for them to be able to incorporate bigger squad training sessions, which is something that I know they've done a lot of work on over the last couple of years, is making sure more people have access to, particularly in Melbourne, we're obviously lucky to have some of the best facilities in the world at Melbourne Park. But there's no point having good facilities if you're not getting lots of athletes to use them.
Yeah. So you don't train at the National Academy, right?
So I'm in an academy a couple of times a week. Okay. Luckily, as I said, we've got quite a good squad that we've built up in there. But I've never been a part of the academy per se.
Okay, yeah, that's so interesting. And I know you were playing Premier League and you're playing the UTR tournaments. How significant have these events played in refueling that the expenses that you've lost?
Well, I mean, Premier League is one that's always been great for me, particularly the last 4 or 5 years since I've been playing with MCC Glen Iris. They've looked after me unbelievably well, and I'm privileged that I've been able to captain the team, and we've also managed to find some success. A bit more due to the other guys around me playing very well and me just tagging along for the ride. But yeah, obviously that contributes heaps. The UTR tournaments that Tennis Australia and UTR have just put on, obviously we got a bit unlucky that here in Melbourne we went back into COVID lockdown. So we were supposed to have 2 more of those UTR events, but those have been postponed until a later date. But yeah, the first one of those events was great. And you can use those events really the same as Australian money tournaments. Get a little bit more money in the bank account, and essentially then that's the money you're going to spend to buy your plane ticket overseas.
Yeah. And if we put this whole thing into perspective, if you look at Australian rules football, if you're the 41st, and that's what you're ranked in Australia, if you're the 41st best Australian rules football player, you're probably going to be hitting or making more than 6 figures, 100,000 a year. And I understand that they get a lot more media coverage than what lower level futures do. I get that, but it really does seem sort of unfair when you look at different sports.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's tough. It's one of those questions that's never going to have a good answer, because the team sport dynamic versus individual sport dynamic is obviously massive. But I think it was about 2 years ago, one of my friends actually did based off of one of the AFL player rating charts. I think the 41st ranked player in the AFL at the time was actually Joel Selwood, who's captain of Geelong and making, 700K plus a year. So yeah, there's a difference, but also I think that comes back to a base difference between individual sport and prize money based sport versus salary based team sport. Yeah. But having said that, people tend to forget that let's say if first round of a Grand Slam at the Australian Open this year, the losers got $90,000 each. But what people forget is that $90,000 is not in pocket. That's not 90 grand into savings. That's take away a coaching cost, maybe a physio cost, your travel, all these factors that go
tax off that as well.
Pay tax, pay your coaching over the pre-season. You've probably spent money that you didn't have to get to that point at the start of the season. Whereas if you're talking, let's say, a team player, their coaching, facilities, training, that's all on top of that amount that's on their salary. So they wouldn't be investing that money back necessarily.
It's almost like you're an individual contractor for yourself, whereas if you're playing on a team, you represent that organization. So you're under them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. All right, Aaron, thank you so much for coming on. I know you're even during the COVID, you're busy training and you're busy investing in yourself. Thanks so much for coming on, and all the best. And I'll hope to catch up with you when I get back to Melbourne.
100%, mate. Thanks for the chat. It's been awesome.
Absolutely.